All right, looks like we are live. Everybody, welcome to Standing for Truth. I am your host, Donnie, and tonight is the night you have all been waiting for. I've got Professor David McQueen and Taylor from the Snake Was Right YouTube channel with me to debate everybody's favorite topic, the age of the Earth. Old or young. Professor David McQueen will be defending, of course, the young Earth position tonight, and Snake Was Right will be defending the old Earth position. These gentlemen have debated before and have demonstrated themselves to be very knowledgeable and well studied on this topic. This will be one to remember for sure. Taylor, David, gentlemen, thank you so much for giving us your time for tonight's heroic debate.
I know from conversations with Taylor that there's a snowstorm where he is. Here in Louisiana, it's 30 degrees. We're going to put the Christmas tree up. Just leave it, because it's obviously going to snow here before the 1st of April. Good to see you, Taylor.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And we haven't talked before other than just before the show. So this will be fun.
Yes, I agree.
This will be fun. I appreciate it, guys. It's a privilege. And for the audience sake, I will go over the format for tonight. We're having, as usual, a formal debate. We're going to be having 15-minute opening statements. Snake Was Right is going to start us off with that. Then we're going to have 10-minute uninterrupted rebuttals. And that'll bring us roughly to the hour mark. Then we're going to have a 5 to 10-minute break where I will go over reminders, announcements, as we do have a busy couple months ahead of us. So I'll go over some announcements there. Then we are going to get into everybody's favorite part of the debate, the open discussion, where David and Taylor will be discussing the points brought up during the openings and rebuttals. Then we will have a 5-minute closing statement. And then this is where we get you guys in the audience involved. We're going to have an audience Q&A. The audience Q&A is always a ton of fun. Please make sure you're tagging me with your questions at Standing for Truth. And that way I won't miss them. Okay, well, before we get into the party and the fun, why don't we kind of break the ice, get to know the debaters a little bit. Professor David McQueen, Snake Was Right. Why don't we start with you, Taylor? How's it going? How you been, and a little bit about yourself and your channel.
Hey, not too bad other than the constant snowstorms, but so I run a channel called Snake Was Right, and it's about skeptic stuff, atheism, and science. So I'm a molecular biology student, and so I have that take on the science. And but the other thing that I think kind of distinguishes my channel is, at least among the atheists, is I have a very particular crusade against moral relativism. So I have a theory for objective morality, and I also consider Marxism, socialism to be pure pseudoscience, so I go after that as well. So skepticism all around. It's that's kind of my big deal.
Well, I appreciate that introduction, Taylor. Your channel link is in the description box. So if everybody likes what they're hearing from Snake Was Right, check that out. Professor David McQueen, his information is also linked, including his playlist that can be found on this channel, where we've got, I think at this point, over 40 videos, lectures, debates, and so on. So Professor McQueen, thank you so much for being here. A little bit about yourself and how's it going, brother?
Well, I noticed, I thought it was Chewbacca at first. My family's a big Star Wars fan. I can see the models behind you. It's obviously a dog, not Chewbacca there. So I appreciate the Star Wars emphasis there, Taylor. My background is that I'm a professional geologist. I have taught university science, George Mason University in Virginia, was a year at Virginia State University, and then out west and then to East Tennessee. So I've been around the professorial block teaching chemistry and physics, geology, obviously. I was at the Institute for Creation Research in the mid 80s for 4 years. And you'll find, Taylor, that I'll make reference tonight in my debate to several comments of my former boss, Dr. Henry Morris. I was Bob Gentry's lab assistant for several years in the early 70s, and I'll be referring to Bob Gentry's work on the radioactive halos tonight. So I have some personal experience in areas, including moral relativism that Taylor mentioned a minute ago, that we may get into in the next 2 hours. I have an undergraduate degree from Tennessee in 74 and a master's from the University of Michigan in 79, both of them in geology. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that introduction there, David. I appreciate the introduction from the both of you. So I see the chat, people are making their way in. So if you were not here 5 minutes ago, again, please, we are going to be having an audience Q&A. So just make sure you're tagging me, and that way I won't miss your question. So let's get right into the debate now. Snake was right. We're going to hand it over to you. You've got a 15-minute opening statement. So whenever you're ready, get yourself comfortable, and I can start your timer. I can also give you a 1-minute warning when we hit the 14-minute mark, just to kind of let you know to start winding things down.
And I'm taking notes, Taylor, so I'm listening to what you're saying.
All right. I guess I'll start the timer now. So I have 3 main points that should remove any reasonable doubt as to the age of the Earth, as they certainly do for me. They're not overly technical because I try and include the layman in this conversation. Though personally, I have gone through several calculus and upper level chemistry classes that do include doing calculations on ages of various radioactive decay products. So, I mean, I've done the technical analysis, but I'll try and keep it simple. So unless we want to get into details. So to begin, I always like to include the context that the young Earth flood model was originally overturned by Christian creationist geologists. So that in itself, it should be telling as to why they thought that the geological timescale was so massive. It goes to the fact that they are putting science over any bias, that they clearly have a bias towards creationism, but still change their minds. And you can still be an old Earth creationist, et cetera, et cetera. So just by this fact alone should be at least a little bit of evidence toward an old Earth. So it's confusing as to why so many people hold to a literal interpretation of Genesis, because this doesn't even follow in the tradition of the very biblical Christians who originally came up with the old Earth theory. So, simply put, the best chemistry available to us uniformly shows that the Earth is billions of years old, and all cross correlates and confirms each other. And there's all the consensus geology as well. So the only people who tend to question the results from all these various different fields are people who state unequivocally that the evidence doesn't matter if it conflicts with biblical accounts. You mentioned you worked with ICR, and they openly state that no matter what the science says, the faith always comes first. There is a statement of faith that says the scientific aspects of creation are important, but secondary in importance to the proclamation of the gospel. By definition, no apparent, perceived, or claimed evidence in any field, including history and chronology, can be valid if it contradicts the scriptural record. And quite simply, this is essentially scientific fraud if they're claiming any scientific evidence, because they have already conflicted themselves with the science. So I'm not accusing Professor McQueen of this. I know he used to work for them. I'm not sure how much he agrees with such statements, but there's no other scientific faction, especially consensus-wise, that does anything similar to this. This should be very suspect. So I guess that's my overview. My three main points starts with the deposition rates. So at its fastest, we've only observed limestone deposit 2 inches per year in ideal conditions, which are warm, calm, acidic, shallow, low pressure waters. So not exactly the picture of Noah's flood. The thinnest layer of limestone at the Grand Canyon is, at its thinnest, it's 300 feet thick. So that'll take 1,000 years to deposit at maximum speed. So actually, it's 3.1 feet per 1,000 years, which would make 300 feet close to 100,000 years. So that's over 32 times the 6,000-year-old time scale proposed. And that's the thinnest part of the thinnest layer of limestone. Let's see, I'm not a geologist, but this is the consensus of geology. Maybe Professor McQueen has some scientific evidence that limestone can precipitate faster that I'm not aware of. And there's a bunch of little things like this, and I just picked this one because it's kind of the most interesting to me. The main points that I'll get into is the nuclear decay law. So I guess just a little bit of overview. Nuclear decay, for anyone who doesn't know how it works, it's due to the kinetics of the atom, which is the way that the subatomic particles move around. Nuclear reactions can look similar and have similar results, but they are not actually accelerated nuclear decay. That's because you're bombarding atoms with subatomic particles. That's not the same as latent decay. So the main question, the radiometric dating is important because it puts conclusive dates on the age of the Earth. And creationists tend to like to bring up errors in the dating methods, which really are the exception. Every tool has fails. Most of the failures have been studied and corrected. There are updated, more accurate, modern methods that have been replaced. And every single actual case that I've personally looked into as well has been the result of the creationists not knowing what they're doing and actually not testing the right types of rocks, or they're just cherry picking one single failure, whereas all the other retests are conclusive. So there's this question of accelerated nuclear decay as a rescue device for explaining why the Earth looks so old, because everything we observe, the nuclear decay rates, don't allow for the Earth to be young because they've been apparently decaying for billions of years. So let's see. And every single example that I've looked into of claimed accelerated nuclear decay has been falsely attributed. So there was a particular example that sticks in my mind. I think it was let's see. It was by Jenkins. Jenkins et al. And so this supposedly found fluctuation in nuclear decay because of the sun. And there was a follow-up experiment that found out that this was an error because the original experiment was using a Geiger counter, which works because it has a gas, and it detects radiation whenever any of this gas particles are ionized by any source. So they took away the Geiger counter, used a more accurate counter. There was no fluctuation in radioactive decay from the actual sample that they were measuring. And this is universally true of every single case that I've looked into. They've made mistakes like this. There's one result where they bombarded beryllium with electrons and were able to seemingly speed up the decay rate, which I would consider more akin to a nuclear reaction, since this was actually due to collisions with particles. And this is completely unrealistic for nature, because this would require a massive bombardment of the Earth with electricity that's just on an unimaginable scale that would kill off all life. And so it's just not seeming like it's naturally possible to have sped up nuclear decay. But even so, we can even grant that it's possible. It doesn't matter. The second main point I have is the cross confirmation of radioactive dating. So this actually, you don't have to know anything about how it works. You don't have to know any math. As long as, we're assuming that the people reporting the data from experiments are not just outright lying, cross confirmation is the gold standard for cross-checking is the gold standard for confirming that methods work. So if you have different methods getting to the same conclusion, that's scientific evidence. That's the best you can possibly have. So there are many examples of using different radioactive decay dating methods on samples from the same layers or even the same samples of rock. And they're different methods, but coming to the same age of the Earth. And this would not be possible if there were random errors or if it just was not accurate. But we have other problems, like why would God accelerate the nuclear decay of certain layers but not others, and why is that progressively lower? And he would also have to coordinate every decay species to have the same age, because as we know, they do cross coordinate. So you would have to have a manually adjusted local change of the decay rate per layer, per element, and they would all have to cross confirm each other and keep up with each other. So that's adjusting a decay rate of one element to match the decay rate of another, even though they're at differential rates. So what I'm trying to say is God wouldn't have to apply a singular speed up rate. He would have to have a different acceleration rate for each element. And this accomplishes nothing except confuses scientists, when God could have simply put the decay rates or created rocks that looked like they were younger. Now, again, this is tied to the final point, the heat problem, which would require 750,000 times the normal rate of decay, at least. There was a rate project from a young Earth creationist group, and quote, we admit that a young Earth position cannot be reconciled with the scientific data without assuming that exotic solutions will be discovered in the future. No known thermodynamic process could account for the required rate of heat removal, nor is there any way to protect organisms from radiation damage. The amount of heat produced could potentially vaporize the Earth's oceans, melt the crust, and obliterate the surface of the Earth. And that's an understatement. So just from one decay species, you would have 8.5 Fukushimas every square mile for 6,000 years. And if you condense that into 1 year, the flood year, it's 6,000 times worse. And that's just for one decay species. So the problem is at least twice as bad as that conservatively, but there's uranium, strontium, potassium, cesium, carbon species, argon, lead, etc., etc. So creationist Snelling offers a 22,000 degrees at the surface of the Earth, which would vaporize the oceans more than 3 times over. Baumgartner, another creationist, offers 10 to the 26 joules of heat on the Earth for movement of the continental plates, which would vaporize the oceans by more than 22 times over, and that's assuming a 300% increase of the total Earth water to allow mountains to be covered. So there are no calculations or known ways to get rid of that much heat. At minimum, it would vaporize the oceans almost 30 times over, and that's a super conservative estimate. It would probably be closer to 100. So, in fact, it's physically impossible to absorb that heat and have it stay on the planet somewhere. Even if it was contained, it would still be in the planet. It would not disappear unless ejected from the planet entirely. And I've not seen any solution to this. So the other thing is I've also never seen any actual scientific ways to date the Earth. I've just seen biblical methods. And so all I've seen is just trying to poke holes in the scientific consensus, but no actual scientific means of trying to calculate the age of the Earth to 6,000 or around 6,000 years. So that should be about 15 minutes.
Yes, just on time. A snake. It's like you've debated before. I appreciate that. I appreciate the opening statement. And to the audience, I am all caught up on questions. So keep sending them in. Great questions so far. And Professor David McQueen, brother, we are going to hand it over to you. The floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Okay, good. I want Taylor, my friend Snake, to look up this word that I've got behind me. It's irenic. It's a new word for me that I ran across. Try to make my eye a little bit more clear there. Irenic versus argumentative. It's a suggestion that the late Dr. Henry Morris made in approaching this discussion of the age of the Earth. I'll leave you to look up the word irenic and reveal the true definition of it in the next hour. But here's my attempt to compliment and show kindness to Taylor. The one book I've written is called The Mineral Book. And Taylor, I want to send you an autographed and inscribed a copy of this once the snowstorm where you are settles down, where it will actually be delivered by the U.S. mail. And so send Donnie your physical address, and I will send you this book as a thank you for the excellent way that you have started out this debate. I have been studying your previous debates, Taylor, and many of the questions that you bring up in this whole area of relativism and moral stance. I've heard you in other debates ask questions about whether a good God could allow a morality that you see in the evolutionary viewpoint. And these are very important questions, and I compliment you on that. So that's the irenic side of how I began. And now, Taylor, I want to begin a more argumentative side. You know, I am a retired university professor, and when you say the snake is right, I'm assuming that that's a reference to the snake in the Garden of Eden. And so we both have our nom de guerre. We have our presence on standing for truth. And that's the part I want to move to now. It turns out we'll comment more in the second hour about how you are indeed Taylor, and I am David. My friend George is someone I'm going to bring into this debate as time goes on, some things that he's talked about. He always likes to have a joke. And so, Taylor, here's my joke for you tonight. You know, my name is David McQueen, and the other day I lost my ID. So now you can just call me DAV. It's kind of Australian humor. I apologize. So now let's get into the argumentative side of this, and let me make my points in contradiction to what Taylor has said. I'm glad that you said that you've got a science background, Taylor, including calculus. And so that's where I want to begin. I want to encourage all the audience to look up and read Gentry's 1974 work. It's a paper he wrote in Science Magazine. Taylor, if you don't own this book, you need to get one from Used Books. I learned that Bob Gentry, my former boss, passed away a few years ago. I think this is a second edition. There's now a third edition. But a paper that I want to emphasize to criticize what Taylor has said is this 1974 article called Radio Halos in a Radio Chronological and Cosmological Perspective. And I'm going to suggest that even though Taylor portrays himself as understanding calculus, this is certainly an equation that he does not understand. Let me move back out of the way here. This calculus differential equation here, that d lambda over lambda, lambda is the radioactive decay rate, is approximately equal to 3/2 ZR, where Z is the atomic number. I'm going to focus on polonium. Now, I'm not saying the word plutonium. I'm talking about the element polonium, PO. Okay, let's go through the other terms here. The R is the radius, and then E is proportional to the alpha decay during the decay of a element like polonium or uranium and so forth. And let me bring this in close so that Taylor can see it clearly. The R there in the first part of that differential equation deals with a radius. And the radius that I work with Bob Gentry on is, we would take a, what I did with my copy of his book. Here it is. We would take a thin section of biotite, muscovite, actually it would be biotite or fluorite, and I would be paid when I would go in 74 and 75 to take a Q-tip with grit on it, and I would polish down the thin section until we got the diametral section. I'll illustrate this more in the second half, but for now, I'll put it this way. The way I was taught as a young geologist for why the radioactive decay rate is constant with time is they would say, McQueen, you need to look at pleochroic halos in Precambrian through Paleozoic, Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic rocks, and you'll find that the decay rate is constant with time. Well, Bob Gentry took them up on this argument, and he actually measured this radius. And so I was part of the team that helped measure that radius. He did numbers of measurements beyond what I helped him with. But the reason that this is important is if the radioactive decay rate were constant with time, that's d lambda over lambda. If that was constant with time, I've got too many markers in my hands here. If that were constant with time, then this radius here would be constant with time. What Gentry found is that when you actually make the measurements there is a variation in that radius. Now, let me read for the audience and also for Taylor's benefit Gentry's conclusion in footnote 16, which I've read and reread many times, and I would encourage Taylor to do the same. And he says this: since the minimum uncertainty in making the range measurements is 1/10 of a micron, it is actually impossible to determine this differential equation better than some sort of ratio of 0.35. In other words, the d lambda over lambda is not equal to 0. There was a 35% variation in that. And then his comment here, which was published in Science Magazine, mind you, it got through peer review, is that halos furnish no proof that lambda is constant. So my first argument that the Earth is young, not old, is that since lambda is at the core of every dating method that Snake Taylor commented about a minute ago, whether it's uranium lead, potassium argon, all the different dating methods that he claims is an idea of cross confirmation or cross checking, they're all at least 35% in error and certainly cannot be trusted as a evidence for an old Earth. My second argument deals with a book that I imagine Taylor read at some point in his academic training at university, and that's a book by Francis Bacon called Novum Organum. Now, keep in mind that Francis Bacon is considered the father of the scientific method. He lived in the late 1500s, and the book that I have on my shelf, Novum Organum, was published in 1620. And notice what Francis Bacon thinks in terms of as far as the age of the Earth. And I'll read from section 78 if you want to cross-check this. But in the first place, the number of ages is reduced to very narrow limits. What, Francis Bacon? There are limits to the ages? Like if you go back to the Greek and the Romans and so forth? Yeah, listen to what he says. For out of the 25 centuries with which the memory and learning of man are conversant, what is that? 26 centuries. Snake, do the math on that for me. That's 2,500 years. As a young Earth creationist, I would say that Francis Bacon, the father of the scientific method, certainly could realize that if we go back 2,500 years, we add the fact that he was writing this in 1620, see, we come up with an Earth that's thousands, not billions of years old. So that's an argument from the father of the scientific method there. But what's my next argument? How much time do I have? And Donnie, would you pull up the Earth's magnetic field slides?
Definitely. Yeah. Let me pull it up right here. You
And
have 3 minutes and 3 minutes and 40 seconds.
Okay, good. One of the senior leadership of ICR when I was there in the mid 80s was Dr. Tom Barnes. And this 1984 Creation Research Society quarterly article that's referred to here, it talks about Uranus, Neptune, Mars, Mercury, and the decay of their magnetic fields. So this is common in our solar system. Next slide.
Oh, there we go.
So Tom Barnes's argument, going back to the 80s, is that because we have objective measurements going back almost 200 years now, that the Earth's magnetic field is getting weaker, it certainly cannot be billions of years old. The maximum allowable by even the critics of Tom Barnes put it at 25,000 years. And if you go through the argument that Don DeYoung put together in his astronomy book there, you come up with an age of the Earth based on the magnetic field argument of only 10,000 years. So notice what I've done, Taylor. I have critiqued one of the foundational arguments of radiometric dating, the idea that the decay rate is constant. The second thing I've done is gone to the history of science, Francis Bacon, and presented an argument that in 1620 at least, the senior scientists believed that the Earth was thousands, not billions of years old. And then I wanted to give a positive argument as I ended that the decay of the Earth's magnetic field provides an objective bit of scientific data to indicate that we have a young Earth. How much time do I have left before you go to the next slide, Donnie?
You have 1 minute and 15 seconds.
Okay, go ahead and go to that next slide. Now, as a Christian and as a young Earth creationist, part of Taylor's critique is certainly true. And as we go through the next hour and a half, I am going to pull my copy of the Bible over and refer to it. And so I certainly believe that the Bible is a reliable historical document. And because I believe that the Creator God created a magnetic field, as depicted in this slide here, that is able to deflect much of the problems we would have if we had no magnetic field and no Van Allen belt and so forth to protect us from the solar bursts that come to us. So as a creationist, I can see this magnetic field as depicted here being a good argument for God's protection of us. Go ahead and pull me back so I can, we'll talk about that the second hour, save that for the second hour. Go ahead and bring me back so I can give one of my favorite arguments for a young Earth and the way that Taylor and the rest should think about things. My friend, do you know enough about old cars to recognize this as a Chevrolet from the 60s? Taylor? Turns out this is a 1960 Chevy Impala. Best man at my wedding 50 years ago actually had one of these in high school. If I were to find a 55 Chevy that had been driven on the big island of Hawaii and then covered by lava, then this would be an objective way, not radiometric dating of crystals and minerals in lava, but rather this would be an objective way to determine the date of that lava flow. If the lava flow goes over a 1960 Chevy, we know that it's younger than 1960. Kind of a lighthearted approach to a young Earth. I'll end it there, Donnie. Did I get close to 15 minutes?
Yes, a little bit over, which is fine. We're a little more easygoing on the opening statement. So Snake was right. To be fair, we want to keep this equally timed. So we're going to give you about 10 minutes and 30 seconds or so for your rebuttal. So I appreciate the opening statements from the both of you, Professor McQueen and Snake was right. Again, I'm all caught up on the questions to the audience. So anybody new that is in the chat tonight, we are debating age of the Earth, young or old. And we just completed the 15-minute opening statements, and we're now moving into the 10-minute uninterrupted rebuttal. So Snake was right. We're going to hand it over to you whenever you're ready. The floor is yours.
All right. So I was taking notes. I guess first point, not super important, but I guess I'll clarify. So I don't really argue much on the morality of evolution I don't even personally delve that much into like the problem of evil, but the thing to clarify, I guess the big thing that I argue with morality is that if there is a God, it needs to have justifications for its morality, and if it's a perfect God, um, which would be the same. The justifications would be true whether or not there's a God. So my moral situation is kind of agnostic to the question of God. Um, but in regards to evolution and God, if I were to believe in God, I would still believe in a God of evolution. The uh, the argument that Genesis is literal kind of pushes me further away from belief in God, and the reasoning behind that is kind of comes from the argument, the God is the greatest possible conceivable being, and to me, it would be a greater God that could design a clockwork universe that was able to uh, produce life through its own clockwork rather than God having to manually step in and mold literally out of clay his creations. I think it's a much greater God, and by definition would be more likely to exist under the at least that argument. Um, a God creating a clockwork universe capable of essentially unpacking itself and creating everything from its ingredients already from the laws of physics. That to me would be a much smarter, much a being with much more foresight. Um, anyway, small detail, but thought I'd fill up some time because I there weren't too many points here. So as far as Gentry goes, I should have pulled up the actual pages, and maybe I can do that during the break. But I saw in your debate with Reason to Doubt, uh, Jordan, that uh, and I'm gonna have to check this, but from my understanding of what was being read, um, Gentry had to admit that he has no evidence of the heavy elements in the halos, and he and Snelling and other creationists have admitted that the halo fluctuations are not too large to be accounted for by normal rates. Um, so I'm gonna have to check. I'll look up the actual quotes on that soon. But that was from my understanding of all the objections Jordan brought up in your debate, and that those were all just quotations from Gentry's book. Um, and as far as uh, Francis Bacon goes, I mean he's welcome to believe whatever he thinks, but I didn't really hear any data of why. Um, I know that the estimates of the Earth have been getting more and more accurate, or at least we should. That is the element of scientific progress. So I think we've made progress in science since the 1600s. Um, so if the senior scientists of today should be, if we should believe the senior scientists from back then, we should probably believe the senior scientists from today. And the consensus among all of the most qualified people is that the age of the Earth is much longer than thousands of years. Again, just some of the thinnest layers in the Grand Canyon can't have formed that quickly. There's multitudes of problems. There's the fact that limestone can't precipitate out fast enough in a year, and the fact that it would have had to be lithified within hours of the flood starting, because it not only would it have to deposit within hours, but it would have to lithify because there's evidence of it breaking off as rock and being covered up again by what's considered to be flood layers. There's limestone layers between flood layers. So assuming that most of the flood layers were deposited fairly quickly and were just simply covered in um, covered in water. I'm not sure how long Professor McQueen thinks that it took to form all the layers, but it would have to be fairly quickly, and limestone would have to be deposited extremely quickly in fine-grained, non-flocculated form, which would take way longer, and then covered again by flood layers, and all of this would have to happen within a year, and from my understanding would have to happen much quicker because the flood itself would have not taken very long, since there are supposed fossils that were alive at the time that they were buried above these limestone layers. So, I mean, on a time scale of hours, these things would have to have deposited and become solid rock, and those aren't possible. But going back to the halos and accelerated nuclear decay, I can grant that. I don't believe it, and I don't believe there's any evidence of it. But we can grant that, and that just creates the largest single problem that young Earth creationism has at all, and which would be the heat problem. And I've still not heard any addressing of the heat problem. Again, it would turn the Earth into a molten rock. There would be absolutely no water, and that's assuming that we have 4 times as much water as is currently measured on the surface. The only excuses I've heard are, trees absorbing the heat and becoming charcoal. We don't see any red hot glowing charcoal that has a temperature hundreds of times the temperature of the sun, and that would heat up the Earth. It wouldn't just contain heat like that. Charcoal actually heats up its surroundings. And I've seen no calculations for things like mega hurricanes. I've seen refuting calculations that show that even hurricanes with like hundreds and thousands of times strength as the ones measured still would not be able to dissipate enough heat, and even at that point there would be no oceans at all. All the water that would be required to form hurricanes would be vaporized anyway. I'm not sure there's much else, so I don't know. I guess I'll end there.
Okay, I appreciate the rebuttal, and that is a couple minutes that we can throw into the audience Q&A as we have a ton of questions flying in. So we are now going to hand it over to Professor David McQueen for his 10-minute uninterrupted rebuttal. Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
I'm turning my cell phone on. I hope it doesn't cause a problem with my audio, because I want to time my own 10 minutes here to make sure that I can point out where Taylor was wrong on these things. The 3 basic cases that he has made is the idea that young Earth creationists like me cherry pick dates for our critique of the radiometric dating. Well, my critique of what he has said is, if you go back and listen to his critique and also his presentation, he actually did not deal with this d lambda over lambda issue. I was there at Oak Ridge National Labs and actually heard Bob Gentry describe this to me in the early 70s. I looked through the microscope. I made the measurements myself about this diameter that we're talking about. And so many have tried to critique Gentry's work over the years about this business of what would the scientific prediction be? What would the prediction from nuclear physics and calculus be about the radioactive decay rate, lambda, and its relationship to alpha decay bursting through? For many that might be new to the channel, need to understand that the idea is you have a nucleus of the element polonium. Now, it's not plutonium, it's polonium. Very short half-life one that I'm interested in. It decays, and then an alpha particle shoots out from that into a structure of biotite, a mineral, and it produces this zone of discoloration. Imagine dropping Alka-Seltzer into a glass and then quickly freezing that glass. As those bubbles form, you get some idea of what it might look like in an igneous magma, which this evidence indicates cooled within, in some cases, a matter of minutes, hours, certainly within a biblical time frame of a day. So I don't think Taylor has correctly answered this radioactive decay rate problem. The second thing that he brings up is the idea of the creationist critique in places like the Grand Canyon of cross-confirmation and cross-checking. He contends that when you look at the lavas and so forth that Steve Austin and Snelling and Baumgartner looked at in the Grand Canyon and reported 22 years ago in the rate documents around the year 2000. His argument is that the inconsistency between rubidium strontium, uranium lead, potassium argon are trivial. They can be pointed out that they're due to some oddity of the magma of the lava flow or something like that. His point about limestone, I'll return to during our discussion time. He's clearly wrong about the formation of limestone in the Caribbean in a place like the Bahamas, but I'll come to that later. As I critique his third argument, this issue of the heat problem, Taylor has indeed come upon two legitimate critiques of what I've said. Francis Bacon wrote this in 1620. So it is correct to say, McQueen, the reason you're wrong is you're following an antique view of science, not the modern view. Well, my counter argument to that is science is not proven because every university professor that teaches geology at Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, UCLA, writes on the board that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. That's not true just because they say it is. And so he's using a logical fallacy there of appealing to the crowd and dragging a red herring through this discussion. Now, the second thing that he said is true. It is a viewpoint that's antique in the sense that the great scientists of the past were creationists and believed that the Earth was thousands, not billions of years old. But his third point about the heat problem is worth addressing. Taylor's got some things to look up before he comes to our next debate in the future, and I do too. He commented that my colleague Andrew Snelling uses a number of 2,200 degrees C in dealing with the heat problem, that Baumgartner, who has talked about accelerated radioactive decay and rapid catastrophic plate tectonics, comes up with the number of 10 to the 26 joules. So when you begin to write these things down, 10 to 26 seems to be a pretty big number. Many of you are aware that my Australian colleague, George Bond, and I have tackled this heat problem for Standing for Truth, and you can see some of our presentations online about that. I've lost my timer here. Let me go back to it. There we go. 6 minutes into it. And so how would I quickly counter argue Taylor's point about the heat problem? On the surface, it appears insurmountable. But as George and I have begun to look into this, we have begun to realize that there are heat sinks in the earth that have been underappreciated. Those of you that have followed my style of teaching are aware that if I draw a tree, I'm going to draw a cross section. A tree doesn't count on the ocean. So let's go to a boat here with a tree on it. And so this is the surface of the ocean near Hawaii. If you look at the actual heat signature, in physics, heat is often a Q is used for the amount of heat. If you look at the heat signature under Hawaii, there are some very interesting aspects of that heat signature. The area in the upper mantle contains a zone of very unique geophysics. Let me get a different color that may work here a bit better. This zone, George and I think, provides an enormous heat sink. Now, this is just an example. This is not going to explain the entire 10 to 26 joules that Baumgartner mentioned, but it is a start on our research. The idea is that measurements that have been made in these zones underneath Hawaii and other parts of the earth show that there are blobs, B-L-O-B-S. There are blobs of mantle that come up and deliver heat to an area like the Hawaiian Islands. I've been working on the geophysics of this to see if there's a way for these blobs in this part of the mantle, and there we see the cross-section of the earth above me, perhaps these could take the heat away as quickly as it's being produced now. So I think each of the major areas that Taylor has brought up has a legitimate counter argument. It's not as if these are rescue devices. These are careful use of geophysics. How much time does your clock show, Donnie?
Good question. 10 seconds left.
I will bid Taylor. I'll bid Taylor goodbye then on my critique.
Well, I appreciate it, gentlemen. Fantastic debate so far. Lots of great points brought up, and the discussion is going to be a ton of fun. An hour has flown by, so what we agreed upon is a roughly 5 to 10 minute break before the discussion, gentlemen. So during that break, I'll go over some reminders and announcements. Brother David, I can drop your feed as you.
Would you please? Thank you.
All right, here we go. Here we go. Okay, so again, great debate so far. I appreciate everybody being here, and I appreciate all the fantastic questions that are coming in. For the most part, I'm all caught up. So as always, these debates are kind of 2 in 1 because the audience Q&As turn into a second debate. So I want to go over a few reminders and announcements. Last night was a ton of fun. It was, as some people were pointing out, a historical debate. We set a new record. We had roughly 440 people live. I think at one point near the end, we hit that. So between 420 and 440. If you have not yet seen that debate, please check it out. Tom Jump and Dr. Kent Hovind, they debated, is evolution a reasonable scientific theory, or is there reasonable evidence for evolution? We also have Taylor here. Snake was right, who is, and I'm actually trying to look for their thumbnail right now. He's gonna be back here next month debating Kent Hovind. So he'll be taking the evolution debate challenge. And also Professor David McQueen will be back here next month as well. He is going to be debating Jason Torn. So two, again, well-studied individuals, two scientists here. They're going to be debating the Genesis flood. So that's definitely going to be a ton of fun. And also the evolution debate challenge continues again in 2 days. We're going to have Kent Hovind and James W. So they're going to be debating, is evolution a reasonable scientific theory? Also at the end of the month, again, is evolution a reasonable scientific theory? D. Brian Emery and Kent Hovind. So it's been a ton of fun. We've had a ton of, I guess you could say, episodes or debates in this series. If you're an evolutionist, if you're an atheist, and you want to take the challenge as well, you know that these debates are run in a professional manner. We make sure they're cordial and sophisticated. Shoot me an email, and we can start setting you up for debates in late April, early May, I think is what we're looking for now, as the next month is pretty packed. So we've also got, in a few days, Jackson Rowe. And Snake was right. They're going to be debating each other. The topic is who has had more debates against young Earth creationists. So all jokes aside, the great transitional fossils debate, Christopher Silvius and Jackson Rowe. So that will be taking place in a few days. We've also got Dr. Ken Colson, who's going to be back here, I believe, either on the 16th or 17th. Just make sure you guys are staying up to date, having a look at the upcoming live stream section. That's where I have all of these set, as well as you can check the events page on the website, Stand for Truth Ministries.com. I'm doing my best to send over our web designer all of the necessary information, and he's doing a fantastic job editing it and making sure that it is up to date. If you're new to this channel, definitely check out that website where there's endless content, debates, lectures, videos, short clips, articles, links to our books. So a ton of stuff and a ton of content there for you. People probably remember Wade the Wizard and Dr. Dino. They debated a few weeks ago. That was a ton of fun as well. That's been getting great feedback. We are working on a round 2 that is probably going to take place at the end of April. And the last one I will advertise here is an important debate that's coming up. We've had this scheduled for a while. I'm pumped for this one. 2 powerhouses in the debate world, Dr. Shabir Ali, who I had here about 5 months ago. He debated Matt Slick, is God one or three divine persons? That was one of my favorite debates on the Trinity. So if you have not yet seen that, please check that one out. But this time it'll be Dr. Shabir Ali and Chris Date. So they'll be debating, does the New Testament teach that Jesus is God? And of course, on the 18th, we've got the big sola fide debate. Does the Bible teach salvation is by faith alone? Again, 2 powerhouses in the debate world. Dr. Robert Sungenis, he's been at this forever, well-known Roman Catholic apologist, and Kelly Powers. So they're going to be debating, does the Bible teach salvation is by faith alone? And that being said, we've got Professor David McQueen back here with us. He's got probably a nice fresh cup of coffee with him, ready to go for the discussion.
I'll even show the audience the steaming cup. And when it's 0 degrees C out there, it's not hard to have steaming cups of coffee, even in Louisiana.
Cheers, brother. Cheers. Okay, so we're moving into the 30-minute discussion, guys. We're going to keep it one topic, one point at a time. I've also made some notes pertaining to the opening statements. We got some great points to discuss, including dating methods. Limestone, I know, was brought up, as well as another couple arguments pertaining to radiometric dating and the heat problem. So since Professor McQueen just ended with his rebuttal, why don't we hand it over to Snake Was Right? We'll give you the first word here in terms of the discussion. First question, first point, however you'd like to proceed. So Snake, whenever you're ready.
All right. So I'm not sure how early I ended with my rebuttal, but if I could, there were a couple things I left off at the end there, but I'll try and do it quick. So the magnetism does fluctuate and poles reverse, and it's estimated we're about close to a pole reversal, so this is not a problem. I guess my point about Francis Bacon was not that consensus equals true. You're right, that is a logical fallacy, but it did seem that when you mentioned Francis Bacon, it seems like you're taking the consensus view from the 1600s, but not from modern times. So I'm wondering what the standard there is. I guess we can talk about cross confirmation. So the point about how you can get some results that have outliers, the cross confirmation actually is statistically impossible to actually happen without there being some fundamental truth there. I guess I looked up some of the quotations from Gentry.
Oh, let me just stop you there, Taylor. I completely forgot Professor McQueen was on mute, and it looked like he was saying something if you wanted to.
Yeah, Taylor, can I stop there and address a couple things that you just said, and then plus an older point? Your argument about consensus fascinates me because if you and I move ourselves back in H.G. Wells' time machine to 1620, to actually have been around Francis Bacon and then have wandered to Isaac Newton and other scientists of the past, it is true that there was a consensus in the 15, 16, 17s, and even 1800s about the age of the Earth. Your point is well taken that the age of the Earth has inflated in the last 500 years in science. But I think you're missing the point. The point that I'm trying to make here is that as a critic of the old Earth creationist view, I criticize those that come on Standing for Truth, talking about how you can take the Bible and combine it somehow with an evolutionary viewpoint in the book of Genesis. Now, I hope that you and both and the audience looked up this word, irenic. It's a word that was introduced to me as I was preparing for tonight's debate, using the commentary of Dr. Henry Morris, my former boss. He said that as we enter debates, we should have an irenic part of it, which is a part where I compliment you and intend to mail you a copy of my book. And then we have an argumentative part. The complimentary part bears on something you had said earlier, where you were saying, if I were to change my view as an agnostic and believe that God existed, then God would be the God that would be the God of the Bible, simply using evolution to create all that we see. My critique of you in that regard, now that we can move from the ironic part of this to an argumentative part, is that you're wrong on this point, because if God, Theos, allowed 1 billion years of death to produce, as you can see on the chart in my upper area there's the traditional chart showing the evolution of man over billions of years, to create Adam and Eve, then this is not a God of the Bible, but an evil God. And this comes to your interest in moral issues. Um, so, um, let me go. Can I now have a turn to critique something Taylor said?
Unless Taylor had a response to any of that,
Oh, okay.
maybe we'll hand it over to him.
Yeah. So I think that a God, either way, there's kind of a moral issue. There's one God who genocides the entire planet, including multiple children, genocides innocent animals, even though he could just instantly teleport all the animals to safety. There's no way really to eliminate that moral issue there. I think if there's an allowable moral transgression there, it would be with evolution, because their creative destruction is, it's there. Animals are always going to eat each other. You can't. I suppose in a perfect world, you would have a god create things that don't need to consume each other, but that's a different issue. So my point about believing in a god of evolution is that I put the scientific evidence over anything that a scripture would say, because the scientific evidence is actually testable. And so that always will have more weight. Um, and it's not necessarily a Christian God. It's just kind of maybe a deist God that I might be convinced in. So if you're saying that if I had to believe in a Christian God, I have to believe in a literal Genesis, that's probably going to stop me, because it seems the science contradicts that. But I don't think that religions necessarily have to be read 100% literally. There's a lot of metaphor and allegory that even the most biblical literalists will have to concede. So
I'll return to that point I'll return to your point, Taylor, of what's an allegory and what's not. But let me do a direct critique of one thing you said. As you talked about your argument about cross confirmation, cross checking being part of the scientific method, you commented that if God was going to accelerate the rate of radioactive decay, he would have to do it element by element: polonium, uranium, thorium, potassium, argon, lead. But that's not true if Gentry's argument for 74 is correct. If it's really the case that the radioactive halos provide an objective scientific argument that the decay rate has varied through geologic time, you don't have to, God doesn't have to touch the button on all the 100+ elements on the periodic table to get them all to accelerate at different times. My critique of your argument there is that the radioactive decay rate has indeed not been constant with time, and that throws off all the methods. Does that make sense to you, Taylor?
Not quite, because there is still cross confirmation. So God wouldn't have to fiddle with every single element, but just the ones that are cross confirming.
But didn't you say that he had to fiddle with every radioactive? Did I misunderstand you?
I might not have been clear enough, but I was referring only to the relevant decay rates, such as ones used in radiometric dating and the ones that cross confirm. So I didn't mean to imply, he had to change the decay rates of every isotope in existence, that just the relevant ones.
Okay, Taylor, I guess it's your turn now to give me a hard question to answer.
Yeah, so it's like, I guess a good way to conceive of it would be, if you dropped a feather and a bowling ball, they both have their rate of fall. And if you accelerated them both by the same amount, they would still, they'd both get to the um, the the ground of the earth at their respective times. But if you accelerated them both by the same amount, then they would have a different rate that they would get to the ground, versus as if like a different ratio between them. So if you wanted to keep the same ratio of the difference between when the bowling ball hits and when the feather hits the ground, you would have to accelerate the bowling ball and the feather by different rates if you wanted their ratio of when they hit the ground to line up. And that's the
Now,
problem with cross conformations such as like Dalrymple 1991, Alvarez and Azaro 1990, where several different decay species are all coming to the same number. If these rates are changing, this doesn't seem mathematically possible for them to all come up with the same number over and over and over and over, because it would have random.
Yeah, let me respond to that a couple of ways. I have heard in the past Professor Dalrymple talk at the Geological Society of America annual meeting, critiquing Gentry's work, and he did this in both the Arkansas Creation Evolution trial and also the Louisiana Creation Evolution trial that Gentry was part of, the Arkansas part at least. And Dalrymple is simply wrong, and the reason he's wrong is in part because of your misunderstanding of the bowling ball and the feather. So let me go back. I've taught college physics, so let me clarify what you're saying. The feather and the bowling ball only hit the ground at the same time if they're descending in a vacuum. Now, obviously, if you drop them off a tower, the feather will float down because of the air. But see, that's an important issue. The arguments of Dr. Baumgartner, Dr. Snelling about accelerated radioactive decay, about accelerated plate tectonics and so forth, are not a correct analogy logically with the idea of a bowling ball on a feather having to fall in the air or in a vacuum at a different rate, because they will hit the ground at the same time. My counter argument to what you just said is there are mitigating factors in the issue of the rate of or the generation of heat during the whole worldwide flood. Your argument is flawed in the sense that the 10 to the gazillion joules of heat that's supposed to appear on the Earth's surface and evaporate all the water, in the way you portray it as if all that heat hits in the first month of the flood, evaporates all the water, the ark falls to the ground, and everybody dies. There's nobody left on Earth. We've killed all the other people and so forth. Is that your argument?
Well, those calculations were done over about a year, which is about the length of the flood, right?
Oh yes, yeah, right. The flood lasted a year.
Yeah. So I was trying to give the most conservative estimate, so that's over a year. But I guess to clarify the feather and the bowling ball example it's not talking about them falling in a vacuum where they would fall at the same rate, but that they have different rates in the air. So I suppose to tweak the example to make it a little better, if you dropped a bowling ball from several stories up and you dropped a feather from several stories down, and you had it so that they both hit at the same time, then if you accelerated them by the same amount, then they wouldn't hit at the same time anymore. But with radioactive decay, they're starting from different starting points, but they're ending up landing on the same number anyway.
Later on, we'll return to this issue of how you know the initial conditions of the amount of radiogenic lead and argon and potassium argon. I'll set that to one side. I'd like to challenge you on this issue of the origin of limestone and use your example of the canyon. From 1983 to 1987, I hiked the Grand Canyon 5 times in 4 years. And the limestones that you're talking about in the stratigraphy of the Grand Canyon, I've seen and actually had permission to collect in the past. And here is a flawed area of your understanding of the geochemistry of limestone. Let me go back to the whiteboard here. Now, I think a blue will be easier to see. If we draw the Caribbean Ocean, we'll let this be north here, so that this is Florida. New Orleans is about 5 hours south of me. So if we go out of New Orleans and go over to the Bahamas, maybe in the future, Taylor, you and I and Donnie can meet in the Bahamas and actually go to one of the islands there called Andros Island. Around Andros Island are a number of bays, and the three of us can actually walk out on limestone forming. If you're not familiar with this word, you need to look it up. It's a type of limestone called micrite, micrite. It's a very fine-grained, dove gray limestone, very similar to some of the limestones you see in the Grand Canyon and other places I've done field work. I don't know if I have my board. This is not showing up as well. Trying to write this clearly. micrite. Yeah, I think the red does better. This type of limestone, micrite, is forming now in the Bahamas. Were it to be solidified geochemically by varying some very standard high school chemistry parameters like pH, EH, temperature, pressure, partial pressure of CO2. Remember that limestone is calcium carbonate, CO3. So by varying the partial pressure of CO2, you can cause it to precipitate out. Much of the problem that you and other evolutionists portray in young Earth creationism is solved by an understanding of high school chemistry. If you have just the right conditions of temperature, pH, of course, you got to have calcium and carbonate in it. The 300-foot limestone that you talk about in the Grand Canyon can easily be precipitated over a several-week period. The idea that you portray that limestone is deposited in a modern context like the Bahamas of a couple of inches a year, this goes back to the flawed argument that's been argued really since the 40s, I guess, in America, and that is the idea of uniformitarianism. As a geologist, I can tell you, Taylor, my friend, that current processes are simply inadequate to explain the nature of the stratigraphic record. Does that change your mind any about that limestone argument? Taylor is muted right now.
Yeah, I just realized. The current scientific view is actualism, which is not uniformitarianism, which includes changes in rates and catastrophes. But there's no measured rate of limestone deposition that's that fast. Like, do you have any citations that show how fast it goes? Okay, well,
you have to give me a moment to pause. I guess one thing that has taken me aback in your argument is your comment that modern geologists follow an actualism model rather than an idea of uniformitarianism. You've challenged me to find a paper that talks about the rate of limestone precipitation in the Bahamas. I would challenge you, the geologists that I have debated over the years are quite happy to say, no, McQueen, this idea of catastrophic sedimentation, the idea of catastrophic precipitation of limestone directly from seawater, you're the one that you're the one that's nuts about this, because what we're doing is we're taking the limestone rates in the modern Bahamas and then taking them back to Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, 500, 400 million years ago. Am I missing something that you're saying, Taylor?
Well, it's just based on what we know. This is the fastest 2 inches per year is the fastest that's been observed. So there's no reason to assume that it would go faster just because we don't know. Maybe there is some chemical conditions where it could. We have to be able to discover that first, and that hasn't been discovered. So under the ideal conditions, all we've discovered is 2 inches per year, about maybe 2.1.
Okay. Let me respond to that, because we want to make sure. Let's see where we are here. We're at 7:00. We started at 5:30, so we want to have some questions from the group. Donnie, have we actually run out of our one-on-one discussion here? Well, I don't see Donnie, so let me go ahead and make another point and counter argument to what you're saying.
Well, and if we have I want you to respond, but if we have a little time, I'd like to talk a little bit about the heat sinks that you proposed as well.
Oh, okay, good. The heat arguments are important. Now, those in the audience, and certainly you, Taylor, must realize that I have come to view over the last 50 years that the Bible is a trustworthy historical document. So when I flip it over to Genesis chapter 5, and I ask my question, well, how old is the earth? There's some data in Genesis chapter 5 that people might consider obscure. I mean, this is not quite like, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. It's not often quoted. Genesis 5:6 says, and Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos, or gave birth to Enos, he and his wife. It turns out that kind of data provides you and me, Taylor, 3 bits of necessary information about this time before the flood. It gives us the names of the patriarchs that lived. It gives secondly, a chronological framework of primeval history, giving about 1,656 years from Adam to the flood. And Dr. Morris and others have noted for 100 years that there's certainly no internal evidence that would allow us the old earth creationism view, because there's no evidence of any gaps in these records. And when you talk about lifespans in the time before the flood, Methuselah living 969 years, it turns out if you do an actual average and take out Enoch, who doesn't count, so to speak, you get 912 years as the average there. So I guess my question to you is, why do you reject the Bible, not theologically, but historically?
Well, I can't accept it as scientific evidence. Historically, just because there might be some real places, people or places, real people and places that are mentioned in the Bible does not mean everything mentioned in any document is just automatically by default true. I mean, we really discount any supernatural or unconfirmable phenomena in any document.
Now,
the Quran,
yeah. Well,
the
Donnie, we want to
Marco
turn it back
Polo's travels.
Well, I do want to jump in here because looking at the timer, there's two things I still want to make sure we get in, just to make sure the discussion is as thorough as possible. A little bit of background noise on your end, Professor McQueen, when you're talking. Sometimes it's hard to focus exactly on what you're saying with the background noise. But if that can't be helped, that's okay. I just wanted to point that out. And I want to make sure we talk about the limestone, which was Snake was right's first objection, and also give Professor McQueen an opportunity to provide what he believes is one of the stronger lines of evidence for a young Earth, since we've talked a lot about accelerated decay and possible problems for. So go ahead.
Out of respect for the audience, can Taylor and I take one of the questions from the audience, since we've only got about 30 minutes left?
Well, we'll save all the questions just for the audience Q&A. I want to make sure you guys get through the fullness of the discussion first. Snake, you're about to say something. I apologize. What was it?
So I'm pretty satisfied with the limestone stuff. I do want to touch on the heat sinks as quickly if we could.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, like, how, obviously with the amount of heat being produced, the magma would absorb some of the heat, but it's not going to cool down that much heat. As if you have something that's hotter than magma, the magma will absorb the heat. But I'm not sure how magma is supposed to work as any more of a heat sink than the much cooler parts of the Earth that are not that hot.
I dropped my chart there that I was going to use as part of the argument. Ms. McQueen's going to dig down and help me find it here.
Yeah, and the other two objections, I just would ask if you have any calculations with how much it can absorb and how much, like, it seems like there would have to be a magma patch every square mile or so, or else most of the heat would just not even touch these heat sinks, even given the most ideal conditions of heat absorption.
You know, my colleague George and I have been working on this for only 6 months, and so we don't have the full physics calculations done. But do keep in mind that in my model of the Great Flood, there were what was called the fountains of the Great Deep erupting. And so I don't know how many fountains per square mile, but there was a tremendous amount of volcanic activity. The idea of these blobs or zones, here is the mantle and then the very thin crust here. The idea that in the upper mantle, there may be conduits, for lack of a better word, that would take both heat up under the Hawaiian Islands, but perhaps take it away during catastrophic plate tectonics, is something we continue to work on. Now, one thing I want to turn to as a counter argument that I was saving is an argument that has been done in 2018 by a couple of by 4 scientists at Case Western Reserve University. And their argument is very interesting. There's a real paradox about the inner core. Let me move it closer. The inner core versus the outer core. You know, the idea of the outer core is that it's got a temperature of above 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but the inner core is paradoxical because it's very deep, but yet one is supposed to be solid, one is supposed to be liquid. Well, these researchers at Case Reserve published in 2018 in Earth and Planetary Science Letters, they proposed what they call the inner core nucleation paradox. And I'm curious if you've heard of this, Taylor. It causes a real problem for an old Earth evolutionary scientist like yourself, because even if you think that this part of the Earth might be a billion years old or 4.5 billion years old. If you do this calculation of how long it takes for the very hot to solidify, you come up with 10 billion years. Have you heard this Case Western Reserve argument? These guys are not creationists. They're evolutionists, but they see a paradox in the geophysics of this area. I just wondered if you had heard about that.
No, I haven't. But I did want to mention, I guess if we're talking about the core absorbing heat, I guess that my question there would be how that's relevant if the heat is being released at the crust.
Well, it's actually two separate arguments, Taylor. This argument of the inner core versus outer core, that's a critique of an old Earth. The answer, I think, to this challenge of how much heat is generated during catastrophic plate tectonics, I think that if we look at it, let's say this is part of the one world continent, and you've got the flood proceeding over the 12 months, essentially 6 months of deposition, 6 months of erosion. The idea that I think has merit is these fountains of the great deep, or these what I'll call conduits coming from the upper mantle into the crust. It's true that in our modern world under Hawaii, these bring heat up to this point to form the volcanic lavas there in Hawaii. But we're seeing potential that these same conduits could be what an engineer would call a heat sink. And those calculations are ongoing.
So the fountains of the deep would be water, right?
No, not well. It could be. I'm sorry. I guess I need to back up a little bit. The fountains of the Great Deep include both water and lava.
Okay. Well,
Dr. Henry Morris was a hydrologist, and so he thought a lot about the movement of water from the lower crust to the upper crust during the time of the flood. My training is as a geologist, and I think more of these as the fountains of the Great Deep being lava flows coming up. And your point?
Yeah, so my point there would be if under ideal conditions, I guess it would be very cold water. But if it's water, liquid water, it's got to be above freezing temperature. And so all of that would still be vaporized dozens of times over. I included the fountains of the deep in my calculations because I know in the flood story, it needs to account for enough water to cover all the mountains.
Right.
So I assumed there was a 300% increase of the total water volume. And that's still if we're only including the heat generated by plate tectonics and only one decay species, then we're still looking at about boiling off that amount of ocean about 25 times over.
Now, just so I can better understand your model, in your model, what was the height of the highest pre-flood mountain? Was it 30,000 feet like Mount Everest or 10,000 feet?
I guess I took calculations from someone else who's, I guess they were assuming just the highest mountains currently.
Okay, see, in my flood geology model, and people like Tim Clary and Andrew Snelling, the pre-flood mountains don't have to be the height of Everest. As a matter of fact, probably would not be, but rather 10,000 feet. And so variations like that certainly vary the amount of water, but let's not forget a very important point. But let's not forget a very important point. The argument, especially over the last year, that you and your colleagues have brought up about there being a heat problem. It's true, there is a heat generation problem, but I don't think it's a model breaker. I don't think it's a deal breaker, because the historical accounts worldwide never indicate that all the water in all the oceans evaporated.
Okay, let me jump in here, gentlemen, because it's been a fantastic discussion, very intelligent and technical. I appreciate it. And I also really appreciate the fact that you guys touched on all the points, for the most part, brought up in the opening statements and the rebuttals. The live chat has been lively. We've had a ton of questions coming in, so I look forward to rewatching this in order that I can catch some of the stuff I may have missed. So, great discussion.
Donnie, can you pick a couple of questions that have come in and let Taylor and I respond to them?
Well, what I want to make sure we do is stick to the format. So what we're going to do is our 5-minute closing statements now. We'll give Professor David McQueen the last word for the discussion, since Snake, you started the discussion. So if there's anything you'd like to respond to, Taylor, to what David just said, that's what the closing statement's for. Wrap up our thoughts and points. So Taylor, we're going to give you 5 minutes. Then David, brother, we're going to give you 5 minutes, and then we're going to get into some audience questions. So
okay, good. Taylor, you go ahead and go first.
All right. So to kind of correct what I was saying earlier about Gentry, I think I said something that the fluctuations are not too large. So I'm getting this from your other debate with Jordan, but on page 241 of Gentry's book, it says something like, while there are differences in various bands that could be interpreted as a difference in lambda decay rate, such differences more likely arise from the combinations of dose and reversal effects. So, yeah, I didn't mean to imply that he said that that the lambda is not indicative of, or that it's not indicative of a lambda change, but that what I was thinking of is just that they had more likely explanations than that would fit those differences than the lambda decay change. And there was also from page 272, the radii were about the size expected from the consensus models. But I don't mean to poach too much from Jordan's debate with you, but that's just something I noticed. And then so yeah, I suppose we've kind of tackled the heat problem enough. There's not. It seems like you just are okay saying that you'll discover some solution to the heat problem. I think that it is so monumentally large that it is model breaking, because, as I said, I'm going as conservative as possible. I'm giving, maybe I'll adjust my numbers for more water. What would that be? It seems like you said maybe that would be like twice as much water. So still would boil off by over a dozen times. And that's the most conservative estimate with, again, only one decay species. So I'm not adding in all the heat from all the other several decay species. But that's going to be at least twice as bad. So I suppose I'll just clarify again what my position on cross confirmation. So to me, this is just mathematically impossible that there is such a level of cross confirmation. Again, just to explain, you would have to have some kind of fine tuning of the rate of each different decay species to always get to the same end product date. So the whole analogy I was trying to explain was just to say that you would have to accelerate these different species. It's not like you could just apply a blanket acceleration. Something would have to and it couldn't come from the same cause, because something would have to adjust a decay rate of one species a little bit faster than the other in order for them to get to the same point. And this would require such a level of fine tuning, and I do not understand why this would occur, other than a deliberate attempt to make the Earth seem older than it is. Because if you were to somehow change the decay rates or create a nuclear reaction that appears as if the decay rate was faster, again, you'd have to have some kind of kinetics that specifically targets each species in a different way and in a way proportional to the rate that is assumed to be constant. And I just can't get my head around that. And so, and if that was the case, it would be because God was trying to get us to believe that the Earth is older than it is, because he could easily have made the decay rates look scientifically like the Earth was young. So it seems like there's a problem if there's a God that is that wants us to believe that the Earth is young, and a God that has foresight that will know that the best scientists in the fields are getting confused by this decay rate meddling. And of course, even if we give all of that decay rate, we come to the worst problem of all, which is the heat problem. So I think that's about it.
Okay, I appreciate the closing statement there. Snake was right. Again, this has been a great, engaging debate and many fantastic points discussed. So, Brother McQueen, we're going to hand it over to you.
Okay.
You now have 5 minutes as well for a concluding statement.
Let me respond quickly to one of the challenges that Taylor made. Earlier on in our debate, you commented that Gentry's work on giant radioactive halos isn't often discussed, and you're quite right. In 1970, he wrote a paper which again was peer-reviewed in Science, and I know you have a copy of his book, Taylor. This is page 226, and the title of his paper was "Giant Radioactive Halos Are Indicators of Unknown Radioactivity." The reason that Bob Gentry was allowed to be a visiting scientist at Oak Ridge National Labs is that he claimed that certain of the halos that he had found, here's an example of what one of them looked like, that these giant halos were actually objective scientific evidence for super heavy elements way beyond 103 in the periodic table. And this captured the imagination of Oak Ridge National Labs. The work that he did on that was really groundbreaking, and even critics like Professor Dalrymple and others that have literally written a book on radioactive dating methods haven't properly responded to these giant halos. So now let me go ahead and go to my closing statements, because again, there are critically important issues at stake in this whole issue of the age of the Earth. If the Earth is old, and I disagree with Taylor's viewpoint that God somehow didn't show us clearly that the Earth is young, because I think the Earth's magnetic field and this whole argument that has been brought out in the last 4 years about the inner core, outer core problem does show some real problems with the old Earth viewpoint. But we want to go beyond that to what does the Bible say about why this is important. And this is why I'm motivated to discuss these issues with Taylor and the others. If you go in the Bible to the New Testament, to 2 Peter chapter 3, I'll close with this passage, which is very important to me and I think should be important to Taylor and the others that argue an old earth. In 2 Peter 3, we find this written. We know this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers or mockers, walking after their own lusts and saying, well, where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continued as they were from the beginning of creation. And I would suggest to you, Taylor, that some would view your comments as mocking the truth of Scripture. But let me go on. This is the uniformitarian idea. Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continued as they were from the beginning of creation. That's uniformitarianism, plain and simple. For this they willingly are ignorant of, reading out of the King James, that the word of God, that by the word of God, the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in water. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and new earth. I think I may have skipped a verse there. I did. Sorry. My pages are sticking together here. Sorry. Whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. But the heavens and the earth, which are now, are being kept in store for a time of judgment. And as you go through the rest of the book of Peter, it talks about this famous passage about one day is with the Lord 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. Peter was a knowledgeable man. If he had wanted to talk about a very old span of time, there were words in the Greek language for millions and billions. Why didn't he use that? He chose to use a very large span of time as being 1,000 years. What is my point? My point is this. The issue of the age of the earth is critical because it has been an argument, a hammer that has hammered the Bible since the late 1800s. But I would suggest to you that the anvil of the Bible has worn out those hammers, and that the argument that the earth is young is fully supportable by the scientific evidence I presented tonight and the evidence from God's Word. That's it, Donnie.
Okay, perfect timing. I appreciate the closing statements from the both of you. Again, great debate. I appreciate it. Very easy to moderate. You guys were cordial, professional, and sophisticated. So that's my kind of debate, gentlemen. So what we are doing now is moving into the audience Q&A. We've got a ton of great questions. So in order that we're not here all night, I want to respect the time and endurance of the debaters. I'm going to put a timer here. And for each question, if this is okay with you, we'll give you each 2 minutes to respond. But whoever the question is for, we'll give you 1 final minute to respond. And
very well.
That way we
Not
can
a
move
problem.
along. Okay. Well, I appreciate it. And let's get into the fun. I'll go all the way back to the questions that first came in. And therefore, I apologize if some of these questions have already been answered in the discussion, but I'm just kind of going in order from when they came in. Okay, here we go. First question comes in from Jeremy Nolan, and this one is for you, Snake. He asks, for Snake, if Earth is 4.543 billion years old, how can any rocks be younger than that date, since rocks are just recycled?
Okay, so that's not that you can just date an atom. It's that there are chemical systems that reset when, the rock is recycled, and we can measure the decay of what's been solidified since the rock recycled. So there's not an absolute date of how old the atoms are. It's that there are conditions that are set up during the recycling process that then decay.
Thank you, Taylor. Over to you, Professor McQueen.
There is some truth to what Jeremy there is critiquing, and let me draw it this way. Um, I've got to get a real whiteboard eraser because this washcloth is not working very well. There's some truth to what he says. Donnie, you were very kind a minute ago to call our discussion sophisticated. Is it because of his blue hat and my bow tie that you call us sophisticated? Is that the idea?
I think that might be it.
That
And you're
may
both
be
Star
part-
Wars fans, so.
Well, that's Star Wars. I won't get into I won't get into that part. Well, let's go back to Jeremy's argument here. He's talking about the rock cycle, which is I've taught my first Geology 101 class in 1980. That's over 40 years ago. So we talked about the rock cycle where in tectonic processes, igneous and metamorphic rocks come down through, sedimentary rocks are cycled back, volcanic eruptions, and so forth. Well, part of what Jeremy is arguing is actually quite true. If you look at the elements, if you look at the minerals that are in a rock such as granite, oh, my hand does much better than the cloth. If you look at the minerals that are in granite, you've got quartz, which is silicon dioxide. You have feldspar, which is an aluminosilicate. You have mica. So you've got all these minerals. Well, inside the mineral mica is often a zircon, and it's a zirconium silicate, but the mineral structure is big enough that uranium and thorium, for that matter, can get trapped in that mineral. And so why, Taylor, would it not be true that if some of this that gets recycled here comes back to the surface and then is ejected into a lava over the Grand Canyon, how come it doesn't read as 4.5 billion years, but rather reads a much younger date? Because it's the same mineral that's being recycled.
I appreciate the response, David. And Snake, question was for you, so go ahead, take your time for final word.
Well, it's not that anyone's dating the actual singular zircon atom. It's its relation and ratio to other initialized conditions.
Well, my friend, you're actually wrong on that point because it's not the rocks that's dated, it's the minerals in the rock. And so we both need to do some more study on that point. Okay, Donnie, you want to go to the next question?
Do you want to, just to be fair, I appreciate the engaging back and forth on that one. Snake, do you want a real quick final word since it was your question? And then I'm going to get a question for you, David, right now. Go ahead, Taylor.
Well, I think perhaps I might not have explained myself correctly, but I think we both understand how conditions change ratios of atoms, and that's actually what we're measuring.
All right, well, let's get right to the next question here. This one comes in from SWE. I appreciate the support. She put in two super chats, two $10 super chats. So I really appreciate you guys are the life and blood of this channel. So blessings. The question for you is for you, Professor McQueen.
Okay.
So she asks, what does McQueen think of isotopic dating, which analyzes the decay of the radioactive element neodymium-142? This technique can only be used to date rocks roughly 4.1 billion years old or older.
Okay. Donnie, since I view you as in my class too, the correct pronunciation is neodymium. At least that's the U.S. pronunciation. In the book that I'm going to send you, Taylor, I've got a periodic table in the back of my book. And so let's look up neodymium here. And neodymium is element 60. And it's got an atomic weight of 144. And so this individual is arguing that neodymium, which is Nd, have these isotopic ratios that have very long half-lives. Well, my response to that is neodymium is element 60. Uranium is element 92. As a matter of fact, it's just below neodymium in the periodic table. And uranium has got the famous U-238 and so forth. And so my argument goes back to the foundation of my presentation for the young earth. Whether you're talking about, let me get rid of this rock cycle business here. Ms. McQueen is talking to me, and I don't understand what she's saying. Oh, okay. Thank you. There we go. Whether you're talking about neodymium and its ratios or uranium-238 and so forth, Gentry's basic argument about how the radioactive decay rate, as indicated by this differential equation, d lambda over lambda, the fact that the decay rate is not constant knocks out the neodymium dating as well as it does the uranium. What do you think of that, Taylor?
Well, I appreciate that, Brother McQueen. And that's why you are the team geologist. Appreciate the response. Taylor, back just in time. Go ahead with your response.
We can move on to the next one.
Okay. Let's see here. Lots of great questions to choose from. And okay, here's a good one that might help clarify a few things. And pickled grammar. So this one's for you, Professor McQueen. So we got a good solid mix of questions for the both of you.
Okay, let me turn around and look here. Pickled grammar. Okay.
Were the halos created during creation or during the flood?
Very important issue. Bob Gentry drew this distinction in the book that I've referred to. And so the polonium 218 halos were created either on the first day or the third day of the creation week. Why? Because these have such a short half-life that they are indicative of the solidification of granite in less than 24 hours. Okay, so that is creation week. I'll call that CW. And now we move on to a whole different category of halos that Gentry studied and that Andrew Snelling and others that have had an interest in uranium over the years have studied. And that is polonium halos, or rather radioactive halos, in coalified wood. If you go to the western U.S., and I'll draw my tree here so you can see a cross section, you find a type of uranium deposit that's called a roll front uranium deposit. Water moves through an area rich in, it carries with it uranium, and it moves through an area that may have some wood in it. It creates a halo, which starts out as a circular object, but it becomes oval in shape. And so Gentry's research on this coalified wood has been able to show us that this type of halo, produced in a roll front uranium deposit, probably dates from the time of the flood, whereas to use Gentry's vocabulary, he liked the word primordial. I'll use the word creation week. So there are two different types of halos, some during creation week and some thousands of years, 8,600 years later in the flood. Taylor?
Thank you for that response, David. Taylor, over to you if you had anything you wanted to add.
Well, obviously, I don't have an opinion on whether they were created during creation week or the flood. I don't think either is. Yeah.
Okay. Unless you wanted a quick final word, Professor McQueen, we can move on to the next.
I hope that I have shown to Taylor and to the audience a sensitivity to his viewpoint. But his nom de guerre is Snake was right. My comment is that Snake is wrong, and that's the reason he doesn't have an answer to an argument like this.
Oh, we got some fighting words there. You guys are keeping this fun.
It'll all go away when I send him the copy of my book.
You guys are making this a fun, entertaining, and sophisticated debate all in one. So
I do confess I was looking for my bow tie during the last question, but I could not find it.
Well,
I was trying to
one day Donnie will be as sophisticated as you and I are.
Yes.
I can only dream, gentlemen. I can only dream. I got the SFT. I've got the SFT uniform shirt now just to make dressing for these debates easier than it used to be. So I'm sorry. Go ahead, Taylor. You're going to say something.
You got to either get a tie or a hat. One of those.
Yeah, this blue T-shirt stuff.
Yeah. I appreciate it, guys. So next one is coming in for you, Taylor. Alec Cox is coming at you. This looks like it's more of a critique, and therefore we'll read it out, and then we'll give you the opportunity to respond, of course. So Alec Cox, $10 super chat. I appreciate the support there, Alec. God bless you. So he says, radioactive heat and regular heat is not any problem. It rained only 40 days. Most of the water came from under the crust, working as a cooling tower, just as nuclear power plants work today. And he says, cooling off. Go ahead, Snake. What do you think about that critique?
Yes, but if there's radioactive meltdown, which would be producing about as much heat as accelerated nuclear decay would have, then what you've got is you have too much heat for the water to take away, and the entire reactor starts literally melting. And so the problem there is just like in nuclear reactors where the water turns to steam, and that's actually how it's powered. What you're going to have is the entire ocean turning to steam and the entire crust melting.
Thank you, Taylor, for the response. Professor McQueen, over to you if you have some comments you'd like to make.
My dad served in World War II, and so what's going on in the war right now in Ukraine touches my heart. What's going on there and represented by the Ukrainian flag is no joking matter. But I must admit there was a side of me, maybe it's a Saturday Night Live side of me, that found it comical that the Russians north of Kiev actually bragged about, we've captured Chernobyl. And so now they got their tanks sitting there in this radioactive quagmire. You know, it's not really something to brag on the international stage of, that you have captured the very reactor that caused a meltdown and a nightmare. What was being argued there, I think, in one way is good. Here you've got a nuclear reactor, and it's true that H2O is used to cool that reactor. And part of what Taylor is saying is true. That does generate steam to produce electricity and so forth. But the overall point that the amount of water that's moving up through the crust, we can change this now. Let me find a different color here. We can change this now to the flood model, where we have this water moving up in the Earth's crust, and we've got Noah's Ark above here. floating. You got all this water coming up. That certainly would be one part of a comprehensive equation of the resolution from a young Earth standpoint of this heat issue. So the point is well taken that it could be that subcrustal water is part of the solution. I think that these zones of what are called in the literature blobs or conduits from the upper mantle up might be a better way, but I hope you can see that one of the arguments that Taylor has made is that a guy like me and other young Earth creationists are following an old science, an antiquated science. Is that really true when you have people like Gentry in the 70s publishing in journals like Science a counter argument? And is that really true if people like me and George and Baumgartner and others are trying to work through this heat issue? It is a problem. We are not suggesting that we are going to use certain things as rescue devices. We're trying to work through the physics of it. That's it, Donnie.
I appreciate that, David. And Snake, we'll hand it over to you for a final word since the question was for you.
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, I was trying to account for the fountains of the deep in the calculations that I used. I'm not sure whether you were implying that the mountains in your interpretation of the flood would have been higher or lower. I didn't quite catch that.
Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I should have made that more clear. A modern Mount Everest is above 30,000 feet. The indication that we have in studying the geology of the Earth is that probably in the pre-flood world, the highest mountains were 10,000 feet. Now, in my case, this comes from a study done by a guy named Jody Dillow, part of which is correct, part of which is not. Jody Dillow did this study back in the 1980s. So that's where I get the 10,000 foot number for my model.
Okay. I thought I might have heard it would be 10,000 higher than Everest, but that clarifies.
No. I'm talking about absolute elevations.
Well, I mean, that seems to make the problem worse just because it requires even less water, which per unit heat. And so we still have a lot more heat than the water can accommodate.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you so much. We are moving on to the next super chat that comes in, Jungle Jargon, and he gives a $5 super chat. Thanks so much, Jungle. So he says, Snake, there is no fixed rate of the passing of time in the universe. So how is it that you assign an age to the universe?
Well, I guess you'd have to ask the physicists, the astrophysicists. I'm not one. But there is, I'm sure they account for the gravitational distortion of time in their math.
Thank you, Taylor, for your response. Anything you'd like to add to that, Professor McQueen?
Yeah, very much so. During my ICR days, an astrophysicist did come to ICR. And this fellow is quite prominent as a old Earth, old universe fellow to argue points. And Dr. Henry Morris was very gracious in that he gave the astronomers an opportunity to say that he was wrong in thinking about the act that not only the Earth is 6,000 years old, but the universe itself. And the argument that the astronomers often use is the Hartsprung-Russell diagram, HR diagram. And many of you that have had intro astronomy know about this diagram. And the idea is you've got the main sequence stars and other stars, and they have a certain apparent temperature and so forth. And so the astronomer, Hugh Ross, who came to ICR back in the day, he argued that if you look at the different stars in Orion and our sun, and you look at Alpha Centauri, they have these apparent luminosities and so forth. And because they fall on lines like this, it indicates that the universe is very old. Well, the counter argument that was given that day, this would have been about 1985, I guess, is that Scripture clearly teaches that stars are like plants and animals. They're different kinds. They're very hot stars. They're very cool stars. And so what is being interpreted in this HR diagram, Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, is actually simply different kinds of stars. And in actuality, we can draw a big old circle and an X over that as an argument for an old universe. Donnie?
Thank you for the response there, David. And Taylor, final word?
Yeah, I do know one way that the universe is dated is through measuring starlight, and light does travel at a certain speed in a vacuum, even outside of close proximity to gravitation, just in microgravity. So, and there's things like parallax and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm not too interested in astronomy myself personally, so I don't have too much to say about that.
No worries. Thank you for the responses, gentlemen. Next super chat comes in from Christopher Silvius, and he says, question for both debaters. So we'll get both of your input on this one. He asks, is hydroplate theory, so one of the different models of when it comes to flood geology, a reasonable explanation for accelerated nuclear decay and a solution to the heat problem? I guess, Taylor, you started with the last question, so we could always have Professor McQueen start with this one if you'd like.
No, I don't think it's a solution to the heat problem. It's one of the generators of heat, in fact. And what was the other part?
Let's see. Chat's moving quick. I think I will. Here, I'll just paste it, and here we go. Is hydroplate theory a reasonable explanation for accelerated decay and then also a solution to the heat problem?
I mean, if it's generating a ton of electricity, there might be some reasonable explanation for what was it? I forget the species, but there was for beryllium-7, but that's not really relevant in any radiometric dating methods. So, and that's the only one that we really know of it if you bombard it with a bunch of electrons.
Okay.
Years ago, Colonel, I didn't write Colonel very clearly, but Colonel Brown was a part of the Institute for Creation Research years ago. And during his time working on an overall model for the worldwide flood, he came up with what HYDRO, spelling is not my forte, I apologize. He came up with this hydroplate theory. This has been debated among creationists for the last at least 40 years. And it turns out that I am not a proponent of Colonel Brown's hydroplate theory. It's an interesting concept. And the way that I would bring it into our debate tonight is clearly Colonel Brown uses the hydroplate theory as one of his evidences for a young Earth. And so because both he and I believe that the Bible is a historical document. We have a point of agreement on that. But notice the science of this. He is a trained scientist and has come up with this idea. And a great many of us reject that and have a different model that revolves around catastrophic sedimentation rates and worldwide, that kind of thing. Does it not strike you as interesting, Taylor and others, that here are two scientific groups who agree on one point in the sense of the earth being young, but have two different ways of approaching it? In my training, a multiple working hypothesis is a legitimate tool of science. And so is it legitimate to say that creation scientists are equally religious and equally scientific as evolutionary scientists? What do you make of that, Taylor?
Well, I don't see any statements of faith or any statements equal to the ICR statements of faith in the consensus sciences. So I would say not.
Oh, Taylor, my newfound friend, you're clearly not right. Could I, as a young earth geologist, go to Harvard or Yale and apply to teach and be allowed to teach my model? No, of course not. The senior professors at both Harvard and Yale, Michigan, Penn State, would discriminate against me, not allow me to teach at all, because I was not part of their consensus view of the age of the earth.
But they don't have a statement that the consensus can never be overturned by scientific evidence. I mean, by definition, any time you're going to be teaching science, you're going to have to go with the consensus. Obviously, teach whatever controversy is in the sciences or unknowns. But
my
there's
friend. No. Does that mean that Copernicus had to go with the consensus view that the Earth was at the center of the universe? Of course not.
I'm talking about modern times. But
say it again.
I'm talking about modern times.
Okay.
If you have a university, I'm not sure why you're going to teach a view that's not in the scientific consensus. If you somehow produced evidence that could overturn that, that's actually welcomed in the sciences, and it's given awards if you can do that.
Well, you have to forgive me for laughing at your comment, Taylor, because my own personal experience, having been denied a PhD at University of Michigan over my view of creationism, I would say that there's actually a lot of pressure can that be brought on people that don't follow a consensus view. But Donnie, back to you.
Okay, let's Taylor, since it was your question, if you want a really, really quick final word, then we'll move on to the next one.
Yeah, I mean, there's I guess I'd just be repeating myself, but there is no actual rule against it. You just have to be able to back up your evidence, and it will be accepted.
All right, well, let's move to the next one. We're going to get through because time flies by, and we could have probably a 10-hour Q&A. The questions keep coming in, and we've had a lot of questions throughout the debate. So we'll end it with two more. Make sure that we get these super chats in, guys. So again, David, Taylor, I appreciate you guys making such a great, memorable debate. So this one comes in from Cutie Mouse, and this one is for you, Taylor. So Cutie Mouse says, Taylor, can you prove experimentally that for uranium-238 sample, the decay rate at its half-life is half at the time equals 0, and the decay constant at half-life is equal at time equals 0?
The uranium sample is its half-life is at 1/2 at time 0. That's not really how half-lives work. And yeah, at time 0, the sample is at 100%. So if I'm understanding the question right.
I think that we find a point of agreement, Taylor and I. Cutie, if we imagine there to be 10 atoms of U-238, then the meaning of half-life is what time does it take for that 10 to reduce in half to 5 atoms? Now, the half-life of U-238 is more than 4 billion years. I hope you find that of some interest, because U-238 is a poster child for radiometric dating. Why? Because it's got an old half-life. Once again, every argument about what's called T1/2, or the half-life of something like radioactively decaying uranium, every argument here goes back to the argument that has been used for many years, and that is that the overall critique of radiometric dating always falls into 3 categories. I've covered extensively tonight the fact that I don't believe the clock has ticked at the same rate. But there are 2 other areas that have been talked about again for 100 years, well, at least 70 years since World War II. And that is, how do you know the number of atoms in the initial igneous rock, or the zircon inside that? Do you know that there were 10 atoms or 1,000 atoms? And so we don't know what the initial conditions were. Let's use the ultimate here. Uranium decays to lead, Pb. How much lead was in that original rock? And then the third argument that means a lot to me as an economic geologist is, how do we know that lead was not added or subtracted during the 4 billion years? We don't know that. And so these 3 basic problems of radiometric dating, nothing that Taylor has said has resolved them. That's the issue of the constancy of radioactive decay, the initial conditions, and the effect of leaching, what geologically would be called leaching, on it. Donnie?
Thank you, David. I appreciate the informative answer. And
by the way, Donnie, I do have strength for one more question, in part because Ms. McQueen has cooked supper and I'm starving, so I need to go to that.
Absolutely. And well earned, well deserved. So we're going to get the last super chat and we are calling it a night. So Taylor, did you want a quick response to that?
I mean, I agreed with the first part, but I would say that there is cross-confirmation does let us know that these methods work, and there are various methods, isochron dating, just knowing the chemistry of certain things like the resistance to zircons of certain magmas does clue us into what the initial conditions were.
Okay, thank you so much. And here's the final question of the night, and then we are going to wrap it up. Again, fantastic debate, guys. I appreciate it. So a question comes in from Marin. Question for Taylor. Why does he believe in carbon dating when there was so many cases where that method dated living creatures tens of thousands of years? So in order to reword it maybe a little better, why do we find detectable levels of C14 in samples of fossils that date back to millions of years?
Well, I mean, first of all, you don't carbon date fossils. at least not the lithified fossils. Surely this Marin has probably heard rebuttals to this before. There's instances where, seals are dated much earlier or much older than they are. That's because they're actually consuming older carbon. There's a lot of cases like this where there are known ways to contaminate the carbon cycle, and scientists try to eliminate as much of this as possible.
Thank you, Taylor, for your response. Thank you, Marin, for your question. And over to you, Professor McQueen, for your response.
Well, since this is our last question, I want to give my sincere thanks to Taylor for taking this debate seriously, and look forward to sending him the complimentary copy of my book. So I'm very appreciative. Now, let me be a critic of what he just said. Carbon-14, as used by archaeologists, for example, and looking at pottery and so forth, is never used past 50,000 years archaeologically. This fascinating area, which has been covered on Standing for Truth, of carbon-14 being found in dinosaur tissue and also in diamonds. The dinosaurs, let's say 100 million years old, the diamonds being maybe 1 billion years old. Creation scientists are building a fascinating research base around the soft tissue argument and also the presence of carbon-14 in diamonds. I called, in preparation for this debate, Dr. Larry Vardaman, who's now retired in northern Idaho, and I asked him about the carbon in diamonds research. And Baumgartner and Andrew Snelling and Dr. Vardaman, they're trying to find additional funds and a way to continue to walk down this path of the data produced in the rate book 20 years ago. So many critics have said, oh, it must be, just like Taylor said, some sort of contamination. Research will continue. We will find out. Will we not, Donnie?
That's right, brother. That's right. Professor McQueen, I appreciate the response. Snake, final word, since the question was for you, and then we are going to wrap up this great debate.
Yeah, I mean the limit to carbon-14 is about is a little younger than that, and I do know that there were a few times where carbon-14 being analyzed in diamonds was also found to be lab error. It was actually just latent carbon in the actual machine that was analyzing the diamond. So it was not in the actual diamond. It was in the machinery. So yeah, I mean that's about as concise as I can get it.
Okay, that wraps up the debate. Again, gentlemen, thank you so much for giving us 2.5 hours of your time. I just want to thank you so much for that. Professor
You're
McQueen,
welcome.
Snake, you guys have earned yourselves the night off and a good dinner, David. So you go enjoy, brother. Taylor, you as well. You enjoy your night. And also thanks to the audience for tuning in. Standing for Truth is out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I am back, guys, just for a few minutes here. There we go. Another fantastic debate, another one in the books. We've now hosted and moderated more than 160 debates on all types of topics. theology, soteriology, creation, evolution, age of the earth, evolution, philosophy, the Trinity, and more, guys. So if you're not yet subscribed, or you just discovered us, but you love debates, you're a debate addict like myself and those that debate on this channel, check the website, standingfortruthministries.com. Also, check out the playlist section, debates hosted by Standing for Truth. You'll find over 160 debates that'll keep you busy until probably the rapture. So great diversity of topics. And I just want to thank all the debaters, because we couldn't have so many great debates if these debaters were not willing to give us their time. So again, last night we set a new record. We had roughly 440 live viewers for the historical debate between Tom Jump and Kent Hovind. Combined, I think they've had roughly 700 debates, because I know Tom's had debates in the hundreds. Kent, last night, that was his debate number 271. So it was guaranteed to be one to remember, and it certainly was one to remember. So we're going to be having tomorrow off, as we've been pumping out content and debates left and right. So we're going to have one day off tomorrow, and then we are going to be back on the 11th for a debate between Kent Hovind and James W. And then the very next day, we're going to have a debate between Jackson Rowe and Christopher Silvius. We've also got Snake Was Right, who debated here tonight, back with us. First thing next month, he's going to be taking the Standing for Truth Ministries Evolution Debate Challenge for 2022. He will be debating Dr. Dino. Is there reasonable scientific evidence for evolution? They have debated in the past. They debated a few months ago on the Genesis flood and Noah's Ark. That one was a ton of fun. So, check the description box of this debate coming up, and you can find that one as well. We've also got some big theology and soteriology debates at the end of this month. Again, we've got Chris Dade and Dr. Shabir Ali. They're going to be debating, does the New Testament teach that Jesus is God? This debate will be huge. This debate will be one to remember, as I like to say. Then we've also got the big justification debate. Does the Bible teach salvation is by faith alone? Dr. Robert Sungenis and Kelly Powers, two debate powerhouses in the world of formal debates. Last week, I debated Luca Medugno. Is there evidence for human evolution? So if you love the topic of human evolution like I do, make sure to check that debate out. That one was a ton of fun. And I thank Luca for engaging me in that debate. And a couple of nights ago, Matt and myself, we spent over 4 hours dismantling arguments from Gutsy Gibbon. So that was a ton of fun. Great feedback there. I've pinned a comment in that debate that you can find in the comment section, where I've got a bunch of sources and references and citations listed if people want to check that out. So that being said, I believe Hurricane Havoc says SFT is afraid to debate me on what is better, DC or Marvel. That would be the debate of the year. But we all know it's DC, of course. I mean, you can't beat Batman or Superman. So, you know what? Challenge accepted, Hurricane Havoc. So just looking through the chat, guys, I apologize again if we didn't get to your question. We have fantastic live chats. Our audience is great, always engaging, always makes these debates that much more fun. So we always get a ton of questions. We could literally do a 3-hour audience Q&A. So we get through as many as we can. And I just want to thank you guys for all your questions. If you didn't get your question asked tonight, just make sure you bring your question for the upcoming debates that we have. Also, any atheists, any evolutionists, anybody that wants to get in the ring, as you know, we have the Standing for Truth Ministries Evolution Debate Challenge for 2022. It's been a ton of fun. So we are a ministry that puts out a lot of content. We're working on some books for you in the future, as well as some conferences. But we also have members of the team that will engage and debate the critics. We think it's important to spend time with the critics and engage counter arguments to our position. We're confident with our model here. And so if you are an evolutionist that wants to enter the octagon, then feel free to step up. And I know specifically on Facebook, there's a lot of creation evolution groups where you have thousands of evolutionists in those groups that like to talk a big game over the keyboard, right? And if they're really angry, they'll smack, the enter bar with their forehead. Time to step up, get in the ring. Let's do it. We're hosting debates every single week. Again, as I've pointed out, we've hosted over 160 debates. So there are a huge number of us, young Earth creationists, that are willing to debate and engage the critics. As you can see in the upcoming live stream section, we've already got a ton of debates scheduled and ready to go for the next couple months. So best way to contact me for those interested is over our official website, standfortruthministries.com. Go over to the contact section and you can fill out a form or just email me directly, truth is hate 2017 at gmail.com. George Bond in the house. Great debate. David and Snake made for a very sophisticated debate. Tons of great topics discussed. Dating methods, limestone, the heat problem, possible solutions to the heat problem. It really was a great debate. I'm very, very happy with the debates we've been hosting. We like to keep them professional, equally timed, no ad hominems, and civil. And so that's what we've been doing. Guys, you can see behind me, we've got SFT gear. This is the SFT logo shirt that you can find on courageousclothing.com. You can also see some of the books we've written. For example, behind me, the classic heterozygous Adam and Eve picture that we got done and made up. I love that. I love that picture. That is the Independent Origins Handbook, written for the layperson. We've also got several other books refuting the critics that are a little bit more technical, where we cover all the best so-called criticisms and objections to young Earth creation, and more specifically, the biblical model of ancestry. So you guys can pick those up as well. The one leaning up against the globe. Flat earthers. There's nothing to fear but the sphere itself. The one leaning up against the globe is special creation. And that one goes through a number of the more technical objections to young Earth creation, where we debunk people like Joshua Stramidas, Biologos, Dr. Dodgeball, Dan Stern Cardinal, and critics like that. The book that I'm currently working on, throughout the night, I put in about 4 or 5 hours, and for the upcoming Human Evolution Handbook. So it's going to be the most up-to-date book on human evolution, and I am making sure that it is done right, in the sense that I want to have strong rebuttals to all of the possible counter arguments that I have seen of late from the critics of young Earth creation and the proponents of human evolution. Also, some books that I highly recommend that you can see behind me as well, and not limited to those. Books that we have not specifically written. We've written about, I think, 12 at this point. You can find it on courageousclothing.com. But books that I highly recommend, not written by us. Of course, replacing Darwin behind me. Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, his new book coming out, Traced. I'm pumped for that one. Carved in Stone. That's a great book by Dr. Tim Clary. Chimps and Humans. A geneticist discovers DNA evidence that challenges evolution. That's by Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins. Contested Bones, Genetic Entropy. And I specifically mentioned these books because I recently saw a comment from a young Earth creationist who said, in response to another young Earth creationist who asked for books that could be recommended on human evolution. And he said he can't currently recommend any books, which I thought was bizarre. So I'll answer that question. I highly recommend Contested Bones, Bones of Contention. Again, I highly recommend Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins' book, as well as his other book, More Than a Monkey. That's a great book. Short and sweet, but it really touches on a lot of fantastic arguments. And of course, Genetic Entropy, one of my personal favorites. And up there, Searching for Adam. That's got a great number of chapters that focus on debunking human evolution and providing evidence for separate ancestry. So that's just a few that come to mind. And of course, the books that we've personally written, check out creationistclothing.com. You can rock the, as you can see behind me, the SFT mug, a whole bunch of shirts, and Jerome M. Awesome. Just ordered Carved in Stone. Now I need Professor McQueen's book. Yeah, Professor McQueen's book I got around here as well. That's a fantastic book. He did a great job on that one. The pictures really stand out. So, yeah, for sure, check that out. I can link Professor McQueen's book if it's not already linked in the description box of this video, but I believe it is. I believe it is. So also, we are trying to hit 100 patrons for 2022. Guys, we need your help. We want to continue putting out full-time content, hosting the best debates, the best lectures, and putting out the best videos. We have a couple movies or documentaries we're currently working on, Debunking Dawkins being one of them, as well as a couple others that were kind of just in the brainstorming part of the whole process. So that being said, that's all that really comes to mind right now. Again, another one in the books. I want to thank Professor David McQueen. I want to thank Snake Was Right for an awesome debate, one to remember. And also I want to thank everybody in the chat. You guys are awesome. You guys are the life and blood of this channel. And you guys are the reason why we're growing so much. We should be at 9,000 subscribers soon. We're about to hit 1 million views. And all of this could not be possible if it weren't for you guys. And of course, all the glory to God. So again, God bless. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for all your support and great questions tonight. Standing for Truth is out, and we'll see you on the 11th.